Episode 67, the Book of Deuteronomy. The ending of one book is the start of another one. In our case, it's the Book of Deuteronomy. As we'll begin to look at the book, what it's all about, and why it was written. Welcome to the history of the Bible. In the last episode, we concluded not only the book of Numbers, but also concluded the life of Moses. The ending of the book of Numbers has come, and it's time that we start the following book, which is Deuteronomy. However, the book of Deuteronomy is pretty much a summary of Israel's journey up until the point of Moses' death. There is a reason for that. As we'll begin going through the book of Deuteronomy, it will mostly be used to summarize all that has happened until this point in history with the Israelites. There will be some new information. For the most part, though, it will be information that we have already covered. To jump back into the book of Deuteronomy, the book itself is the last book to be written by Moses. Thus, it would also be the last book of the Pentateuch. Throughout the book itself, it refers to Moses being the one to give the words that are contained in the pages of Deuteronomy. Often, the book of Deuteronomy could be considered by some to be a second law. That is where we get the name Deuteronomy from. The Greek translate the word Deuteronomy to mean copy of this law, whereas the Latin word is translated to mean second law. In reality, both are misrepresentations of what the book means. The Hebrew name of the book that we call Deuteronomy is translated to mean these are the words. This name refers to the words of Moses. In Deuteronomy, Moses doesn't give a new or second law. Instead, Deuteronomy is about the words of Moses explaining the law. This is why some scholars believe that the book is primarily a set of sermons preached by Moses to all of Israel right before his death. Because the words of Moses were given shortly before his death, that would mean that the Israelites were located in the plains of Moab. If we remember, the plains of Moab is where the Israelites were camping while preparing to cross the Jordan River into the Promised Land. However, Balak was afraid of the Israelites and brought down Balaam to curse the Israelis while they were camping in the plain. This would lead to Balaam giving his advice to the Midianites and the Moabites to seduce the Israelites through their women and using sexual cult practices, which worked. So the Israelites needed to deal with the issue of the Midianites on the battlefield. It was while in this location that the setting of the book of Deuteronomy is set. Yes, it does reflect on their journey up until the point of the Israelites camping in the plains of Moab, but the sermons themselves are given in the plains of Moab by Moses. Moses would then take the sermons that he gave to the Israelites and put them in written format, which is the book of Deuteronomy. The book itself is believed by some to be written in a structured format that resembles the treaties of the day, also referred to as covenants or agreements. During the time of Moses in the ancient world, treaties were written from one nation to another in very specific format. It would start with a preamble, which would identify the parties within the covenant. Then would come the historical prologue, which gave the history of the leader with his people. This would be Moses and his history with the Israelites. In other nations, it would be kings giving their history to the people of their kingdom. Next would come the details of the agreement, almost like the terms within a contract. Then would come the call out of the witnesses to the contract being made. After that would be the details of the curse and blessing if the contract or agreement is not held. And lastly would be the oaths and the ratification of the agreement. Other scholars believe that this isn't the case. Moses was not following a historical format for writing agreements. The reason that this is believed is that in the book of Deuteronomy, there isn't any covenant renewal or redoing of the ratification. Although we do know that while the Israelites were in the wilderness, they did ratify the agreement between them and the Lord. Plus, what is in the book to conclude Deuteronomy is an encouragement from Moses to follow the Lord, or in other words, to stay within the covenant that has already been made. Either way, all of the words of the book of Deuteronomy are given in the plains of Moab. This would be 40 years and 11 months after the Exodus from Egypt. Because it was written in the 11th month on the Hebrew calendar, that would mean it was around the time of January or February, and believed to have happened around the year 1405 or 1406 BC. Moses would have been 120 years of age. The sermons would be given within 40 days before Israel entered the Promised Land. As for who wrote the book of Deuteronomy, that would be Moses himself. He would be the one who compiled all the speeches that he would give during this time to the Israelites and put them in written format. Thus is where we get Deuteronomy from. It even says in Deuteronomy 31, verse 9, that Moses wrote down all the laws and gave them to the Levites and the heads of Israel, or the tribal leaders. Now, some scholars believe, just like the other books in the Pentateuch, that Moses did not write Deuteronomy. One of the beliefs is that King Josiah, who lived 8 centuries later, was the author of this book. The argument for this is that in King Josiah's time, there was a discovery of a book in the temple. This book brought many reforms in the nation of Israel. Due to those reforms, some scholars believe that he had the book of Deuteronomy compiled from all the writings that came from the time of the journey into the Promised Land. But even then, King Josiah gathered the writings of Moses, which means Moses still wrote the book. That book that King Josiah found, other scholars believe that he found the lost book of Deuteronomy, and that is what was brought and that was what brought the reformations within the nation of Israel. However, some references are made in the book that would have not been known to Moses at that time. These are believed to be edits that could have possibly been done during the time of the Israelites' exile in the 6th century, 9 centuries after Moses and the Israelites were camped in the plains of Moab. Although it is debated who wrote the book, to go back to what we just talked about with historical treaties, the format does match those of treaties from a period in which Moses was alive, indicating that it was initially written during the period of Moses. When Moses wrote out his sermons, he did so with a mingling of a story, the story of the Israelites' history up until this point of the journey, along with instructions and laws that would allow for the people to live in covenant with God. Although it could very quickly be thought of as Moses' farewell speeches to the Israelites, the book of Deuteronomy is also trying to convince them to not make the same mistakes of not following the Lord. For the majority of the book, it recalls the laws that were already given to the Israelites while they were at Mount Sinai. Moses would also encourage the people to obey the laws that were given to them and to trust in God's promises. It's Moses who wanted the Israelites to trust, obey, and conquer the land. This is where Moses will encourage the people to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength. Because when the Israelites were to pursue the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength, then they would become a people group that would become a light to the rest of the world. However, These were all things that the previous generation was not able to do. That is why they all ended up dying in the wilderness. He would remind the people of God's faithfulness, not only in giving the promised land to them, but also because of the Lord and his mercy being shown to a rebellious people group. As mentioned, the previous generation was not able to step into the promises of God, even though they had seen all the miracles that God did for them in Egypt and the wilderness. This new generation, though, had not seen or experienced those miracles. They had only heard about it from their parents' generation. Most of this generation wasn't even there when the Lord originally gave the law to Moses and the Israelites. So the purpose behind Moses giving all of these sermons was to encourage and remind the people who had not seen the miracles that were done for their parents. The book of Deuteronomy itself is important. Not only does it wrap up the 5 books of the Pentateuch, but it also brings together all of the patriarchal promises, history, and the law into one setting. Because of this, throughout the Old Testament, Deuteronomy is referred to by several prophets, including Jeremiah and Hosea, as well as being the foundations for the reformations that King Josiah would undertake hundreds of years after Moses lived. It's also referred back to many times in the New Testament by both Jesus and the Apostle Paul. The book of Deuteronomy itself can be outlined in that the first 3 chapters of the book are a recap, or looking back at what the Lord had done for the Israelites and their journey. In this recalling, Moses would call the people to remember 4 different things: God's faithfulness, his holiness, his blessings, and his warnings for not following the laws given to them. The 4th chapter is a call to obedience to the Lord. Then, starting in chapter 5, going through chapter 26, is all retelling of the laws that were given to them while at Mount Sinai. Chapters 27 through 30 are all about the blessing and curses. In this section, the Lord gives the Israelites the ability to choose either life and death, blessing and cursing. In the final chapters of the book, Moses encouraged the people and then hands over the position of leadership to Joshua. At this point, it was time for Moses to die. Joshua had been commissioned to lead the Israelites, the people had been encouraged to follow the Lord, and now it was up to them. Again, as we go through Deuteronomy, we'll use it as a summary of the Israelites up until this point since their exodus from Egypt. So join us next time in episode 68, Israel's Testimony. Until next time, remember that you are loved, special, and worthwhile. Thanks for listening to the History of the Bible. Let's get the word out by liking, rating, and following the show. This episode was produced by Nikao Productions. To check out other shows, search for Nikao Productions wherever you listen to podcasts.